Okay, Cyberpunk finally had its major update. This is the 1.5 patch, and they've added so much stuff. And one of the things I'm most excited about is that they've added FidelityFX Super Resolution, in other words, FSR. Now, currently I have the game running at 4K, and this is on an RX 6800 XT. And right now the graphics settings, I mean, I guess it thinks that they're on custom, but basically it's on Ultra. And then I'm not running FSR yet, okay? And as you can see, although I think the game has had a few little performance optimizations and things, I don't think it makes a major difference. You can see that we're struggling to play this game at 4K out in the open city environment at Ultra settings. Now, FSR isn't going to take us from, 38 frames per second to a stable 60 frames per second, but, I mean, at least not without using it too aggressively. But I think what we could do is test out what it does for us and then tweak the settings a bit from there, because I've been really wanting to play this game at 4K, but it just hasn't really been that doable. Let's try it with FSR UltraQuality. Now, with FSR UltraQuality, wow, in this scene, we actually did just jump up to 60 frames per second. Now, I play on a gigantic screen. It's a 48-inch screen. So I can tell that there's a slight loss of sharpness, but it looks a lot better than when I just used the game's old version, which was the FidelityFX CAS filter applied to just a normal resolution scaler. You can tell that we're not quite locking 60. We drop a bit below, but on a variable refresh rate monitor, this is actually pretty good. Honestly, that was huge. Again, that's still at Ultra settings and then just running FSR UltraQuality. But check this out. Let's compare the difference. Let's turn FSR off and then just be like, okay, well, in the past, instead of being at Ultra, we could have just, ran the game at high instead of Ultra. Well, what does that actually do for us? Well, in this scene, notice that dropping down to high instead of Ultra got us up into the 40s, where the game was playable. And again, the native resolution is nice. By the way, they did update the weather effects and like how they transition. There's a lot of changes in this update. I highly recommend looking into it. This is like the big update that I think most people have been waiting for to call the game, significantly less broken. But as we can see, high only got us into the mid-40s. But what if we combine the two? What if we go with the high preset, which got us quite a bit of a jump, and then kick FSR onto UltraQuality? Again, slight fuzziness to that image there. Let me double check I have the sharpening pass turned on, because it does let you turn on and off the sharpening. Yeah, we do have it on. And now you guys can see that I'm now over 60 FPS, and now facing this direction, I'm over 70 FPS. And this open city environment with all of the vehicles and pedestrians and things like that does tend to be one of the more demanding areas of the game. I think you can find some slightly more demanding ones, but this is a pretty good test of a stress test in Cyberpunk, and I am now running the game at 4K, high settings, FSR UltraQuality, and honestly, it looks pretty good. Now, I don't have ray tracing enabled, and that's kind of a big question is, can we run any ray tracing? Well, if we kick on the ray tracing, notice I'm leaving the settings at high, and I'm leaving FSR on to kind of reduce the overall demand as we kick on the ray tracing. Now, if we kick on all of the ray tracing, it's just going to be unplayable. Completely unplayable, even with things turned down. You can see we're at an absolute slideshow. So that's still going to be a no-go, and no, dropping FSR a little bit further isn't going to completely fix that mess. So we're definitely not going to do everything. But what if the ray traced lighting was at just medium and we had the shadows and reflections on? Let's see if we could get something kind of playable here. Well, we're still in the 20s, so I'm still going to call that a nope. I think the heaviest ray traced setting in this game is the reflections, although it's also the most noticeable. So in other words, what if we just have shadows on, right? What if we just do shadows? Shadows, especially because they're sun shadows, I mean, although I think they might have updated that a bit in the patch. I should look into it, right? What I'm getting at here is that the shadows aren't going to be as big of a demand. We're up in the 40s here, but it's still not great frame rate wise, and I don't feel like the shadows add a whole lot to this scene. Honestly, I think it's the reflections that are the most noticeable. You'll instantly notice that this wall next to me has reflections now when it didn't before. Although you'll notice again, it did drop our frame rate down into the 30s. But if you want to play at a locked 30, maybe use a controller or something like that, you could get by with FSR UltraQuality at 4K with, the ray traced reflections, which are looking quite nice in this scene, especially on this wall here. Now, if you're willing to let the image get a little bit fuzzier, you could drop down to FSR quality when you're playing at 4K, and it's not terrible. So this would be a lot more usable. We're up into the mid 40s, and I've got to say, playing on a mouse, that feels much better than 30s did. So if I wanted to play on a 4K screen with some ray tracing, this is probably the settings I would go with. I would turn down to high preset, kick on the ray traced reflections, and run FSR down at the quality setting, which I think is a 1440p upscale. Speaking of which, not everybody has a 4K screen. So how about we now kick this over to 1440p and finish out testing the video from here. So first we should probably get a baseline of playing the game at Ultra with FSR turned off. So here is just the game at 1440p Ultra settings. And as you can see, the game actually was definitely playable already at 1440p Ultra settings on the 6800 XT. So that was already not a problem. But running with some ray tracing turned on, again, those ray traced reflections, that was hard to do. So what if we go ahead and kick on some ray traced reflections now that we're playing at 1440p? Is that doable? Well, we drop down again to 40, and again, it's playable. You could do this. It's up to you whether you think the trade-off in frame rate for the increased reflections. I mean, they're very noticeable in this scene. That's one reason why I chose this, is that it's a demanding scene with very visible reflections. However, now that we have FSR available, we could try FSR UltraQuality on our 1440p screen. And to me, this is a bit more noticeable. But it does jump us not to 60 in this scene, although in many other scenes of the game, where we're not out in this open city environment, I think we would be able to get to 60. I do think that this is actually a reasonable way to play the game if you want to use some ray tracing. And if you want to kick on even more ray tracing, we could go ahead and try kicking on the shadows and the lighting at medium.